Sheriff Candidate Forum.
First question, and I'm going to start with Ms. Hennessy. And you can make the correction to my bio then. Who do you, and this is maybe my only soft question tonight, but I thought I'd start with it. Ms. Hennessy, who do you most admire, and what are you most proud of?
I most admire my grandmother, to be honest with you, who's no longer with us. My grandmother instilled a lot of great ethics in me. She was a nurse at St. Francis Hospital, and I just remember her as being a very warm, compassionate, and loving human being.
I admire a great many people. Some are in this room, but it's my wife, Eliana. She hasn't been here long in this country. I think many of you even know the story. Coming here from Venezuela, uprooting herself to join me in San Francisco, a city that she really never knew, and starting all over her life with us, despite whatever challenges or obstacles. It really has been an amazing and just wonderful marriage. We've learned a lot together, and I couldn't be more happy in our union. And what I'm most proud of, and I think anybody here would identify with this, is our son, our child. Our son is just, every day I thank God for the life that we have and the closeness and enrichment that we have within our family because of our child. It's just blissful, and we're stronger every day.
Okay, here we go. It's hard to find out how frequently complaints are filed against employees and deputies of the San Francisco Sheriff Department. There's a link on the website to a general contact us form that someone can fill out if they want to make a complaint to the Sheriff's Department about the conduct of an employee or a deputy. But the only report I could find on complaints against San Francisco deputies was a San Francisco Examiner article that out of 300 excessive force complaints filed against the San Francisco Sheriff's Department from 2006 to 2010, 7 resulted in disciplinary action, or 2%. There's no public disclosure of overall complaints. The San Francisco Office of Citizen Complaints provides independent civilian review of complaints against San Francisco police officers with quarterly and annual reports. What do you think about an independent civilian review process with accountability of the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, and what would that model look like? Mr. Mirkarimi.
As sheriff, we're heading in that direction. First, let me give you context as to why I believe strongly in San Francisco Sheriff's Department's need to uphold transparency where there may not be, or perceptions where there not be. In 1999, I was part of a larger campaign to make even the police commission, the San Francisco Police Commission, that much more transparent. In 2003, I co-led the campaign that bifurcated both the mayor's picks and the board of supervisors picks on the police commission, because I felt that there had not been sufficient transparency, even despite the installed OCC, which I felt had grown weak over the years. In my time as a supervisor, and then in my time now as sheriff, we have instituted a criminal investigations unit, unprecedented for the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, so that we then, instead of relying on the district attorney, who rarely ever prosecutes or rarely ever pursues any kind of grievance or complaints about staff in our office, and it's not just deputies, it could be civilian staff too, then I thought that we need to ratchet up our response for a level of transparency that really helps enhance the integrity and confidence of our department. I absolutely agree that there should be an independent review board. Most definitely, there should be an independent review board. Keep in mind that the Sheriff's Department is an elected body. Big difference from a police chief and its command staff that's appointed, which is overseen due to charter requirement that it have a commission. Very few, if any, elected officers has a commission that is attached to the oversight of the department itself, which is why I think it would be a very interesting precedent and one worthy of pursuit collaboratively, that we should find ways to enhance the transparency, spotlight where they're having complaints or grievances, and not let the Examiner or the Chronicle or any of the press to have to hunt for this information when it should be made readily available. If it is for the San Francisco Police Department, it equally, if not more, should be for the San Francisco Sheriff's Department and all law enforcement and public safety agencies in this city.
Follow-up question. Since you've been sheriff, what have you done to create this process?
Well, as I just said, for the first time in the history of the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, I am creating a more enhanced internal affairs unit where I bifurcated the internal affairs from a criminal investigation unit. Some folks may have even heard of a case recently in San Francisco General Hospital about a deputy who, has been alleged to conduct wrongful action. We, in that criminal investigations unit, our department, forwarded that case after our own internal investigation to the San Francisco District Attorney. It's rarely ever happened about one of our own. And let me tell you, that's a risk, to be able to be ahead of the department and to be able to say that this is what we're going to do to maintain the integrity and competence of the public, of the staff in our department, and knowing very well that there may be a culture in the department that resents this level of sunshine.
Yeah, yes.
But that's exactly what we need in San Francisco. And that's why that we will continue to escalate our efforts to make sure that we achieve that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ms. Hennessy?
First of all, I'm a little surprised that it was so difficult to find that information since Sheriff Mirkarimi has been in office. So I don't understand why that information wasn't more readily available for the press to have to hunt for it. Second of all, the Sheriff's Department has always had, under Sheriff Hennessy, an internal affairs unit and a criminal investigations unit. They just called it something else. And I would say that there were always data available, and I saw them when I was a chief deputy there, and I saw them when I was in internal affairs, to show what the different crimes were that they were looking at. The internal affairs people were always researching investigations on staff, including deputies, and criminal investigations were for other matters. It's interesting, though, that now criminal investigations, and I think this is a good thing, is also investigating crimes that occur within the jails among inmates and others. And that is something I actually recommended to Sheriff Mirkarimi. It was on my list of things because it was proposed to me by a staff member who was very, very familiar with these investigations, that we needed to do this. I recommended it to him when I turned over the department back to him after he came back. So, as far as an independent board or council, I believe in transparency too, but as sheriff, I would have that transparency available. I wouldn't need a board to do that. I'm not saying there shouldn't be one. I'm not saying there shouldn't be an oversight, but it's something that I really haven't considered yet. And I would be willing to talk to people who are advocating for it and talk to people who are not for it as well. But I think it's also important that once you do have a finding of a complaint, a withheld complaint, that you act on it and you hold people accountable. And I think that that's one of the most important things in any investigation. Thank you.
So you would support, you say you would talk to people who would be for it and people who would be potentially not for it. Where would you come down on the final decision about whether there would be an independent board or not?
I would want to see what the pros and cons were of the entire proposition. I'd want to see what are we gonna achieve with this? How is it gonna work? I want to know all the inner workings, who is going to be on the board, who is going to work with the department, and what that means for the deputy sheriffs and the staff and everybody who works in the jails. So for me, it would be a question of doing a lot of research and figuring out if it's the best thing for the department, but not just for the department, but for the city, because it is important that the city serves the people of San Francisco.
Thank you. That's a question we hadn't brought up. Do you want to respond to each other? Let's say a 30-second. Thank you. Let's take a 30-second response.
This might make it a little more spicy. In 1999, I co-authored with 3 other people the Modern Sunshine Laws here in San Francisco. And those Sunshine Laws are our local Freedom of Information Act. And they were some of the strongest laws for municipal transparency, government transparency in the United States of any city. And I co-directed that campaign, and we prevailed. Bay Guardian loved us for it. Others in government did not. So this is not something that came new, and I'm sorry, you may want to take credit, but I campaigned on this in 2011, long before the turmoil that engulfed me, that engulfed you, or anybody else in this room, that I've always been a steadfast believer about transparency and working to break down a culture that is completely resistant to it, even in liberal San Francisco.
Right on.
I have no doubt you campaigned on the sunshine, and I know you worked very hard on that, and I think that's an absolutely great ordinance and a great law. I was talking about the actual transparency while you were sheriff, and I was asking why it wasn't transparent now.
Okay, moving on to next question. Immigration. San Francisco is a city of immigrants. According to the 2013 census, more than 800,000 people live in the city and county of San Francisco, and 49% are of immigrant backgrounds, 34% Asian, 15% Latino. Sorry, I need to slow down. Probably for everyone. What role should the sheriff take in making San Francisco an immigrant-friendly city? And what can the sheriff do to encourage immigrant victims and witnesses of crimes to contact law enforcement and make reports? I believe I started with Ross Mirkarimi last time, so we're going to give Vicki Hennessy.
I think that the law that Mayor Evely signed after it was voted on by the Board of Supervisors unanimously in September of last year sets the stage for treating immigrants like anybody else in jail. And I think that Ross has done that and has worked on that. I also think that an immigrant-friendly city with our language laws and everything else and voting rights contribute to that. I would also say one of the other things that I've thought about quite a bit is that we need to have recruitment from immigrant communities through a path to citizenship so that they can be law enforcement officers in our jails and work in the city with the people that they serve.
Mr. Mirkarimi?
Mayor Ed Lee was a complete latecomer to this issue, that he signed into law after months and months of debate and deliberations about the potency of where we should say no to ICE and secure communities. And one of the things that inspired me, among many, to succeed with blessing from Sheriff Mike Hennessy, who's very courageous in standing up and out as one of the few sheriffs in the United States, in calling attention to the absolute recklessness of secure communities, was that very philosophy that I bought into. And from the moment two moments. When I started and came back as sheriff, I committed myself in working with community and working with governments and working with critics about the kind of leadership we should take. And it wasn't always a very fluid process. You can ask Angela Chan that. I've got about 1 million emails from her. And it wasn't the most, I think, scripted process because it was unprecedented. But I have the honor of saying I am the first sheriff in this city and one of the first in the United States to say no ICE transfers, no relationship with Homeland Security, no relationship with Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, and we will not do it. And when Ed Lee and others on the Board of Supervisors were saying, well, we like the general idea, but we're going to have some carve-outs for this group, I was not for the carve-outs. And I think that debate got lost in the reporting of what went down in the final outcome. We were very concerned about the final product of that legislation that resulted from the Board of Supervisors and what was signed by the mayor, but actually that didn't stop us. We trumped his signing of the law by saying no to ICE because they left the door open to ICE and we did not.
My next question, Ross Mirkarimi has just answered on his part. So the question was, what is your policy on ICE holds today with relationship to the San Francisco Sheriff's Department and ICE holds? And I'd like to ask that to see if you can clarify it.
Well, Ross Mirkarimi started a new, as he said, it's the policy. I don't have any different policy than to say what he is saying because that's his policy. And I believe it's the correct policy. And I do support that policy. I have always supported it since 1989 when we were a sanctuary city. And I chased people, INS at the time, out of the jail that were looking at cards. I supported Michael Hennessy in all his efforts to keep secure communities away. When I was interim sheriff, I met with secure communities people, and I was very, very disappointed in them. I found them ill-prepared, entitled, and somebody that we didn't want to deal with. And I also wrote a letter in support of Tom Amiona's Trust Act.
I want to do a follow-up question with Ms. Hennessy. When you were acting as interim sheriff, it was reported that you didn't want to adopt a policy limiting, a strong policy limiting ICE hold requests because you said you were interim. Can you respond to that?
Yes, I saw myself as the caretaker at that time, and that's what I was. I was the interim caretaker. It wasn't about me, it was about the department, and it was about leaving it in a way for the person who would eventually assume command, and it happened to be Ross, and for him to make those moves when he felt it was the right time to make them.
30 seconds response from Ross Mirkarimi.
I have a great amount of respect for Vicki Hennessy. She was put in a very complicated and difficult position by being the active sheriff, and I thank you for the service that you had extended in my absence. But I'm sorry the way that you just characterized, how you just characterized. You weren't just a caretaker, you were a proxy for Mayor Ed Lee. And it was very clear to me, it was very, very clear to me that in that period of time, there wasn't just, a caretaking of our department. It was a crucial moment in where this department was going to go in the future, and that's why I was anxious to return to make sure no more damage would happen.
Thank you. Vicki Hennessy.
I can honestly say I was not a proxy for Ed Lee. Ed Lee had confidence in me and put me in the position while the troubles were taking place. And I never spoke with Ed Lee or anybody from his office for the 6 months I was there, because he told me when he appointed me that it was my job to do and to do it the way I saw fit. So, You know, when people tell me I'm a proxy for Ed Lee, which I believe will be a narrative for this campaign, that is not true. I am definitely my own person, and I know much more about the Sheriff's Department.
Thank you. Just a last question on immigration. And I want to make absolutely clear, this was a question that was specifically requested by the coalition, so I want to be sure that it's asked, in case it was already answered and it wasn't clear. What do you think the Sheriff's Department policy should be regarding communication with Immigration and Customs Enforcement? For instance, if an individual is detained in the jail and is suspected of being deportable, what information, if any, do you think the Sheriff's Department should share with federal immigration and customs enforcement authorities? And I don't remember where I started this, but since you just... Okay, let's go with Vicki Hennessy.
Deportable for what reason?
Does it matter?
If we're talking about somebody who's been convicted of a very violent felony, I would say it matters. It would matter because that person would be somebody that perhaps we would not want in our jails. But, you know, once again, this is an issue that is very difficult, and I would say that according to the memo that Ross just put out regarding, or recently put out regarding this issue, anybody that is suspect of being deportable will be first, that question will be asked to the sheriff's attorneys before they decide whether or not the person is deportable. So people in the jails won't be making those decisions at all.
And if the person is accused of a violent felony, how would that proceed in your jail? Whether if that person is considered possibly deportable?
I believe you've got to offer that person, if there's bail, they get bail. If it's an alternative release, it's an alternative release. I said earlier, treat them like anybody else, and that's what I'm going to say to this question.
And so you would not contact immigration?
I would not contact immigration for anybody. That's not to say immigration wouldn't follow up and try to contact us, and that we would not comply unless it was one of those severe instances when we thought it was best to comply.
Thank you for answering so clearly. And Ross Mirkarimi.
Well, I'm not really sure it was answered that clearly, because what I heard was a vague statement about severe incidences. This actually spotlights the long debate that occurred at the Board of Supervisors, the mayor, and that played itself out in the press. The reality is that we have a 70% pretrial population. I didn't hear any qualification or distinction whether we're talking about a sentenced or a pretrial population. If somebody is alleged to commit a crime but hasn't been convicted of that crime, we're back in the business of deporting them again? Now, this is exactly what I'm concerned about in taking San Francisco light years backwards, which only corrupts the very laws and policies that we're putting into place. No contact with ICE. No contact with ICE. In the same way that the newspaper or the press gets through the sunshine laws or freedom of information laws, the federal government and any common citizen is able to extract the same amount of information. But I have already spoken to Homeland Security's new deputy director, who paid me and my command a visit very recently, who's actually trying to recruit us on a more touchy-feely secure communities program. I call it not ICE, but thaw. And I told them that there is no room for thaw in San Francisco. And then I heard, summarily after my meeting with the deputy director of Homeland Security, he went out to dinner with Mayor Ed Lee, and I'm still waiting to find out the outcome of that meeting. So this creeping way of trying to undo the kind of laws that really help define the kind of innovative, forward-thinking, just, compassionate city like we are is playing itself out in this debate, and I am sorry the answer was not clear, but I'm very clear-eyed exactly where we need to go in the Sheriff's Department.
to the next question. San Francisco's jail population is disproportionately represented by racial minorities when considering the general population. 56% of the people incarcerated in San Francisco County jails are African American. And yet, African Americans represent just 6% of the county population. What have you done and what would you do to address this issue of disproportionate minority confinement? And I'm going to start with Ross Mirkarimi.
I'm a bit of a wonk or a geek about stats and numbers. So 56% was the 2012 statistic. It's actually 49% today, which does not give, I think, any comfort about which direction we're going, because in this city, San Francisco, which is experiencing the fastest exodus of its African American population of any city in the United States, it's important that we make this a front burner mission of our campaign and anybody else who joins into this campaign of how we are going to structurally attend to this issue. There were two major milestones that occurred over the last 2.5 years where I have taken action or attempted to take action in order to reduce the disproportionate incarceration of not just black and brown people, but poor people in San Francisco that are incarcerated because they can't simply afford bail for the same offense as somebody who's afford bail because they have enough money. Yes. That doesn't make any sense. And this is what begins to showcase the cracks in San Francisco not being as progressive as I think it could be. Now, over a year ago, we drafted legislation that was shot down by the lobbying of Mayor Ed Lee and Chief of Police Sir, that said, let us expand our electronic monitoring authority, because the people inside our jail, the program civilian staff, the deputies, are the best on-site people who can actually say, this person is actually doing really well. They don't have to be incarcerated. They're not a safety risk. We can put them on an ankle monitor and then let them move forward in their lives. When we presented to the Board of Supervisors, I would have never anticipated that I got into a debate with Chief Sir, prompted by Mayor Ed Lee, where they were talking about, we're going to let out murderers, rapists, and thieves. In this day of age, they played the Willie Horton card, and I could not believe it. And the Board of Supervisors got so scared and so intimidated that they actually like, oh my God, we can't do this because we've got property crime upticks. That was a very tangible solution, and I promise you, as sheriff, I'm going to return with that legislation. And the second milestone is bail reform. I'm the only sheriff of the 58 counties in this state that supports wholesale bail reform. This isn't anything where we get to sort of dance on the edges. You either believe it or you either don't.